Hi everyone, it's Marian and welcome to my business life. In this video, I'm going to show you how to propagate your pothos from start to finish. So when it comes to propagation, it's always a race between will it root or will it rot. So for pothos propagation, it seems very straightforward and easy, but if you have a better understanding on the entire process of propagation of pothos, then we can increase our chances to be more successful in our pothos propagation. So for most of us, we want to propagate our pothos because we want to make our pothos to become larger, trail longer, grow bigger leaves. Or on the opposite end, we want to propagate our pothos because we want to save whatever we can from our ailing mother plant. And for most of you, I suspect you're watching this video because you want to know how to propagate your pothos in order to make it look bushier, trail longer, and grow bigger leaves. But for those of you tuning in to find out how you could save your pothos via propagation, then a lot of the techniques that I'm going to discuss in the video will also apply, so keep on watching. So to give our pothos propagations the best chance to survive, we should start with a healthy plant. So if you haven't yet, go check out my Pothos Care 101 video. In that video, I shared with you my best tips and tricks to make sure your pothos grow healthy and beautiful long vines. But for those of you who are trying to propagate because you're trying to save what you can from your ailing pothos mother plant, you can still propagate, but the chances of you successfully propagating, of course, is higher if you are propagating from a healthy mother plant. So just keep that in mind. So first off, I apologize for my hands. You're going to be seeing a lot of it in this video, but I'm sorry if this bothers you. I cut my finger yesterday and I have to wrap it up so that, water and dirt don't get to it while I do this propagation video. And a lot of the advice you get on how to make your pothos bushier again is to make propagations and stick it on top. I highly do not recommend that, and I'm going to tell you why later on in this video as we go through the different propagation process. But one way you could make your pothos become bushier again is actually pruning it. It might seem counterintuitive, but pruning would help make your pothos grow bushier and even grow bigger leaves, because at some point in the trails of your pothos, it would start to grow leaves that are smaller and strangly. The distance between the nodes become longer, and sometimes it doesn't even grow leaves. So that's the time for me. That's my signal to start pruning my pothos. And especially when you already have it trailing down, you can see the part where it starts to become uneven and sparse. So that's usually the point where I cut or prune my pothos. When you prune your pothos from the base, it actually encourages growth from the top. So that's one way you could also encourage growth from the top to make it fuller, is to prune from the base. I don't always do that, of course, but sometimes I rather take a long vine, propagate it from the base, then trim off the length of my vine, especially if the growth are still healthy and they're not yet strangly and they're still producing good sized leaves. So I might just take one long vine, cut that from the base so that will encourage growth from the base, and I will propagate from that vine that I cut. So that's an option you could take as well. And once it starts to go bald like this, more often than not, the mature leaves, which are the first leaves to grow from your pothos, have likely died out. So there will be just empty nodes without leaves. And also what happens is, the reason is also start to look bald because as the vines get longer, it gets heavier, so it tugs down on the vines. And sometimes you can see the stems almost gets uprooted, and you'll have nodes with empty leaves on them. So what I do, especially for this one, just to help anchor the plant and make sure it doesn't get uprooted. I had problems with my Synapses getting uprooted in the past. I put some bobby pins in there to help pin it down. And that way, it could also help move the nodes closer to the soil, and hopefully that would grow roots and another branch would shoot off from that node once it's formed its roots. So I use this type of bobby pin to pin down my plant. So it's the one that is used for updos. So it has a wider space in between the pins. You could take a regular pin and yank it open so that it will have a bit more space, but this one's actually already came like this, so it's easier for me to use. And so I just stick it down and pin my plant. So that's one way to make the top bushier without making a cutting and putting it on top, because that rarely works. So how to make cuttings on your pothos is pretty straightforward enough, but I'm going to show you ways you can make cuttings of your pothos to ensure a higher rate of success when it comes to propagating it and preserving a lot more of the plant as possible and not waste so many parts of the plant as you propagate. Especially if your plant is not this bushy yet. Maybe you only have something like this for now and you want to start propagating it to make it bushier, or if you have like, a more rare pothos that you only had a cutting of and you want to start propagating from it so that it will become bushier. So the ways that I'm going to show you would help you minimize loss from your plant and increase the chances of propagating the cuttings that you make. If I were to propagate from this, I can look at this vine right here and see that it has 2 nodes here without a leaf. This is where I would cut for this vine. So that way when I make cuttings from this vine, I am not sacrificing a leaf so that I could expose a node for propagation, since I already have nodes here that don't have leaves. So I don't have to lose any leaf in order to do that. And I can do one over here too. So actually, let me do this over here. So this one doesn't have a leaf as well. This leaf fell off. So I'm just going to cut that off because that petiole is just going to yellow and it's not going to help in the propagation process. And normally when I would want to cut a propagation cutting, I want to ensure there's like 2 or 3 leaves in it plus 1 node. So if I'm cutting a section of the vine that has 3 leaves, I'll make sure it has 4 nodes. So this one essentially has just 1 leaf yet. This one is trying to grow. So this one has like 1 leaf and then I have like 1, 2 nodes. So I will just cut right under that node, maybe like a 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch below the node, and cut it in a 45-degree angle. And that is 1 cutting. If the remaining vine that's attached to the mother plant, this one would just eventually rot as well. So if you have a longer stem in between nodes, I would also just trim this off a little bit, and same distance, like a 1/4 to 1/2 inch long from the node, and then just cut it. You also don't want to cut it too close to the node because you're not giving space for the new stem or for the new petiole to come out from this node. So you don't want to like cut it too close to the node either. You want to give it a little bit of space. So that's how you make a cutting from the tip, leaf cuttings from your pothos. So when you're propagating your pothos, especially if you're just doing it as a water propagation, it's important to get a better success rate, to have at least 2 leaves and 3 nodes in your cutting. You can do a single leaf cutting and still be successful, but your chances of having a more successful propagation is higher if you do have 2 cuttings. So like with this one, this is a single leaf cutting with 2 nodes and it is starting to root. Sometimes I have single leaf cuttings like this Cebu blue pothos that is yellowing before it can actually form proper roots. But like with this one, it doesn't have roots, but it's trying to shoot out growth, and hopefully that survives before this completely dies out. Because what happens is whenever you make cuttings from your plants, we are basically disturbing its metabolic process, right? What happens is if you do have a single leaf cutting and there's not enough roots yet formed at the node, what happens is it's like the leaf either photosynthesizes too much energy that there's no roots to process it, or the roots are requiring a lot of energy and the leaf cannot photosynthesize fast enough. So basically the propagation or the cutting cannibalizes itself, and that's why you'll have yellowing. And as I mentioned earlier, propagation is a race between rooting and rotting, and you want to give your propagations, especially if you are propagating pothos that are valuable to you, that was very difficult for you to find. You want to give it the best chance to actually be successful in its propagations. So you have to be careful and very mindful when you're making your cuttings for propagation. So my recommendation is at least 2 leaves with 3 nodes per cutting, but I also don't recommend it be any longer than that, because it's the same principle with just single leaf cutting, is that if you have a vine that is very long and you're trying to propagate that, then it requires a lot of energy to keep the entire vine alive before it actually grow roots. So eventually your plant will make a choice between growing roots or keeping all of the vines, all of the leaves in the vines alive. So at some point your cutting will just start to rot because it fails to do either, or it would just start yellowing. So you could concentrate on forming roots, but then if it yellows a lot faster than it could propagate roots, then you just lost an entire vine. So my recommendation is, for the most successful propagation, is to have 2, 3, or 4 leaves plus 1 node. So if you have 2 leaves, you have to have 3 nodes. If you have 3 leaves, you have 4 nodes. If you have 4 leaves, you have 5 nodes. And that's probably the maximum that I would go. Okay, so now let's talk about the different mediums on where you could propagate your pothos. So the most common one and the easiest one is propagating with water. So right now I'm like just turning it a little bit because I'm doing a water experiment, which will be coming out in a few weeks. So watch out for that. So with water propagation of pothos, this is the easiest and most accessible, and most epipremnums, scindapsus, and philodendrons do well with water propagation. So if this is the only method that you're going to use to propagate your pothos, then you're going to be fine. But there are some things you need to keep in mind if you are propagating with water. So right now I'm using clear glass containers, and I know this is a bit more aesthetic, but if you want to make your propagation go faster, and ideally that's really the goal, because again, we're racing against time, we want it to root before it rots. It's better to have a container that is dark, like, you know, the amber containers, or you could just put it in a ceramic jar. I propagated my marble queen pothos after it got root rot in a white ceramic jar, and I was just propagating it water, and now my marble queen pothos is a very healthy plant, and I was able to save it from root rot because the enclosed nature of the container helped the roots grow faster. Because if you think about it, roots grow in the dark normally, so when there's light introduced to it, it slows down the growth of the root. And also, when you are water propagating, make sure you change the water every now and then, because when you're propagating in water, your propagation is processing oxygen through the oxygen in the water. And so once the oxygen depletes in the water, then it would lack the ability to do osmosis and for it to process nutrients. So just make sure you change the water frequently. You don't have to change it every day, but if you see the water getting a little bit dirty or it's going a little bit down, instead of topping it off, maybe just change it out depending on the size of your container. So this one is a pretty large container, so I change it about every couple of weeks. And also with water propagation, especially if you're doing it in the colder weather like I am doing right now, then make sure that your containers are located in a place that is a bit warmer. The roots are not gonna form if the temperature is below 68 degrees. So the pothos needs a temperature of between 68 to 80 degrees to form its roots. So just make sure it is in a relatively warmer place. So don't put it against your windowsill, because our first instinct is to give it a lot of light for it to propagate faster, but that's not really the case, especially for pothos. Pothos, like I mentioned in my pothos varieties video, they can thrive in low light and still remain green. So just put them in a place that is warmer as opposed to brighter when you are propagating your pothos, especially when you are propagating in water, because water gets cold really quick when you put in a place that is colder, especially against a windowsill. So other mediums that you could propagate your pothos, which are my preferred method, is using inert material. So over here is sphagnum moss, here is coco coir, and here is perlite. So inert mediums like this don't contain any nutrients or organisms that might promote the growth of microbial pathogens that would attack your plant before it properly propagates and grow roots. So I like using this because they provide enough aeration for the plants to breathe, but also provide structure for the plants. And like I said, there's no organisms or nutrients, so it's very sterile. It doesn't it's not going to contribute to your plant getting sick as it propagates. But to make sure that it is sterile, when you buy coco coir, usually like with my coco coir, I bought this in bricks and I have to rehydrate it. I use hot water just to make sure if there are any fungus gnats, eggs in them, I would kill them off. And when you're also buying coco coir, just make sure it's not high in sodium, because some coco coir is very high in sodium. So just make sure you're picking out coco coir that does not contain a lot of sodium. And sphagnum moss, same way with the coco coir, you could sterilize it using hot water. Sphagnum moss has been my preferred method for a long time, but because since sphagnum moss is a very hard to come by resource, and that's why a lot of people encourage reusing their sphagnum moss, and I do that. But the thing is, there's no way you could 100% reuse your sphagnum moss, because more often than not, I'm not able to remove all the sphagnum moss from the propagation. So I just end up planting it with the plant when I transplant it into soil. So perlite is a new medium that I've been using to propagate, and this has been really good so far for my Hoyas and for my string of hearts, and this is also recommended for pothos. But I prefer this to water propagation, because if you're water propagating and your ultimate goal is to pot it back into soil, the big reason that your propagation from water to soil don't survive 100% or don't survive at all in some dire cases, your pothos is going to form a different type of roots to process oxygen and nutrients in water than it would in soil. So if you put it into soil, your roots don't have the right formation for it to be able to process oxygen and nutrients from the soil. So that's why I rather use inert mediums when I am trying to propagate my plants, especially with my pothos. But then if you are mass propagating, like I'm doing over here, and you have very limited amounts of perlite, sphagnum moss, and coco coir, then water is your best option. What I would suggest is you can start off with water propagations, that is fine. But before you plant it into soil, you want to have a transition period in one of these inert materials. And the way you would do that is, once your pothos have formed roots in water, it doesn't matter how long the roots are if it hasn't formed any secondary roots yet. So if it hasn't formed any secondary roots yet, I would not risk transplanting it into another medium, whether any of these are directly in soil, if it hasn't formed secondary roots. Doesn't matter how long it is. But then you also don't want the roots to mature so much that it doesn't have the ability to adapt into changing into a different medium. If you're propagating in water, do not wait too long, as the pothos will form roots that will only be able to synthesize oxygen from water and from the air above it. And once you put it in an inert medium, or especially in soil, it wouldn't have the root structure that will be able to process oxygen and nutrients from the soil. This has secondary roots already. Basically, secondary roots are roots that you have the main root right here, and it's like the roots that shoot out from the main root. For this one, I would transplant into one of these inert mediums to propagate, and then once it has formed a lot more roots, then I would transfer it into soil. You're probably watching this and says, I have propagated in water and potted it directly in soil and my pothos survived. I'm not saying that method doesn't work, but like I've said earlier, I'm showing you ways to have the best rate of success in propagating your pothos, especially if your goal is to have like 99% success in your pothos propagation and like the most minimal leaf loss or cutting loss in your entire propagation process, then this is what I would recommend doing. If you're going to start off with water propagations, wait for it to form secondary roots. The minute it starts forming secondary roots, place it in an inert medium like this. And then once it has fully grown roots, then you can transfer it into a potting mix of your choice. But when to know when you need to transfer it from the inert medium to direct potting soil, and that's pretty easy. Once you basically see the roots showing and it's getting a little bit root bound, then you can start planting it up into a potting mix. And I could show you over here. I will insert clips as well of the process of me doing it, but here is my propagations of the philodendron basil that I put directly into coco coir. So with this one, it has been here for like, I'd say at least 2 weeks now. So as you can see, the leaves are still very much healthy. I can even see some new growth popping out. The roots have started to form in just like 2 weeks. So this is, for me, I also find that when I propagate directly into inert mediums, I find that the root growth is a lot faster than I would in water. Because like I said, they are growing in the dark when they're in inert mediums, and the temperature tends to be a little bit more warmer than if they're just propagating in water. So that kind of helps. And since this one is in like a container like this, it also provides some humidity, which also speeds up the growth. And another way that you could try propagating, and I would only suggest doing this, is if you have a lot of cuttings to spare and it's a plant that you could afford to lose. I mean, we've seen growers do this. They propagate directly into soil and they're very successful. That's because they put their direct soil propagations in greenhouses. They give them the optimal condition in growing. So that's why they have high rate of success in propagating directly in soil. And they also tend to pack the propagations. And so if some dies off, there's still a lot more propagations in the pot that they're trying to grow. So this is the Philodendron Brazil. I'm going to show you the clip of it here too, of me potting it directly into soil. And it's been probably a week or so since I propagated this directly in soil, and I've already seen some leaf loss, and I was very confident in propagating this directly in soil because this cuttings had a lot of aerial roots in it already. So it's not like it's starting from the very scratch. And I try to do mostly single leaf cuttings in here, so it's not trying to provide a lot of nutrients for very long vines. So like most of the cuttings here are single leaf cuttings, 2, 3 the most. But as you can see, this leaf is already dying out, and some of the leaves are like trying to shrivel, and they're not, I mean, some of them are doing pretty well. They still look good, but like some are not surviving. So that's just like a risk you're willing to take if you want to do a direct soil propagation like I did with here. This one is just an experiment, but this method is not something that I would do for my other pothos, that especially the pothos that I really care about. I wouldn't try it with my Synapses, and I would even try this in my variegated pothos. One con that I do see in propagating in inert mediums is you can't let it dry out. With water, you could leave it for days, even weeks, and they will be fine. If you are propagating in inert medium, you can't let it dry out. You have to keep it moist. You can't overwater it, but you have to keep it moist. The coco coir and the perlite, they hold water. So you could either put this in a container that doesn't have drainage holes or a container without drainage holes. Either way it would work. Just be careful with the watering. Do not overwater it. You have to keep it moist, but don't make it so saturated because you would end up drowning the roots of your propagations. And if you are using perlite, you're basically propagating semi-hydroponically or hydroponically, because perlite don't have the capacity to hold water. So basically you're just using the perlite to give your pothos structure while it is propagating in water. But same with the sphagnum moss and coco coir, you don't want to put too much water in this. And if you're a person into semi-hydroponics, the concept is pretty much the same. You fill this up with water a third or half of the way, depending on how large or how wide your container is, and just make sure that the perlite is not like swimming or floating in water. And that's when you know you have put too much water in it. And with perlite, I recommend putting it in a container that doesn't have drainage hole, because like I said, this is kind of like propagating something hydroponically. You could also use vermiculite or leca balls, but I do prefer perlite because it mimics more the structure and texture of potting soil, especially if your end goal is to transplant your propagations into potting soil. So as I mentioned earlier, once you propagated cuttings and they have formed roots and you think they're ready for soil, like this Cebu Blue over here, do not plant it directly with the mother plant. You are setting yourself up for failure. And like I said, this might work for you. Some of you may say, hey, I did that. It worked for my plant. But like I said, I'm giving you tips to help you succeed better in your propagations. If you put this into soil, this root that hasn't adjusted the soil yet and you add it to your mother plant, like I said, either one of two things would happen. This cutting would die or your mother plant would die. This cutting right here that has just formed new roots has very different needs than this mother plant. And when you think about it, the soil of your mother plant is probably too much for your newly formed cuttings, even if it has really good roots, because this has nutrients in it. It has organisms in it that this plant, even with the great roots it has, doesn't know how to handle yet. So what I would suggest is to pot this up as its own plant, and then once it's really established itself as its own plant, then you could combine it with the mother plant, and then you can have like a bigger, bushier plant that way. I wouldn't make your plant bigger and bushier by plugging in cuttings into the mother plant right away without this cuttings adjusting by itself and establishing itself as a plant of its own before you combine it to the mother plant or combine it to another established plant. But what you can stick in your mother plant that would do perfectly fine, and I would highly recommend it, because this is no harm trying this, and it would work, it might not work. In my case, I found it to work half the time, because if you have nodes like this that doesn't have leaves on them, and this is especially true when you prune leaves, like I mentioned earlier, that are strangly, that don't have leaves on them, and it's just nodes. So I would cut those up. Just make sure each cutting has a node in it, like maybe an inch long with the nodes in the middle, or maybe something like this, because it has a node here and a node here, and this one's trying to push out growth. What I would do with this one is stick it into the mother plant. And this might grow, this might not grow, but either way, it's not going to hurt your plant. And if it grows, then great, it's a new vine, it's a new branch for your pothos that will help it grow bushier, and another vine that could create long trails. But if not, it's not going to do your plant any harm. It's one way you could use up your cuttings with minimal loss, especially if you only have nodes without leaves in it and you cannot stick that into water. Sometimes I also do stick it into the inert mediums and let it see if it grows that way also, and if it grows, then I add it to the propagation when I pot it up. But more often than not, I just stick it back to the mother plant. And I can show you one that has worked successfully is with this golden pothos. So this golden pothos is originally a cutting with 3 leaves. It has well-established roots, so I potted it up. It has like grown a lot of leaves since, but these leaves back here, if you can see them, those are nodes that I stuck into the soil, and now they have grown leaves. So it could work, but I've stuck probably like 10 different nodes in here, and I have about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them that grow new leaves. I mean, it took a while, it took a very long time, but it did grow. And the thing about this, I don't have to worry about killing the nodes, because it's just an added bonus if it actually grows. So I don't have to change or adjust the care for my plant. I just have to stick to the care of this plant, water it when it's completely dry. I just focus on the health of the actual plant, and the nodes grow. So I would just not recommend putting in cuttings in your mother plant in an effort to make it bushier. Let your cuttings establish and be its own plant, then add it to the mother plant if you still desire to do that, and to make your plant bigger that way. But you might think, well, by the time it happened, my plant has grown bigger. I mean, if that's the case, then it's just, happy all around. But what if your mother plant gets sick? So the worst case scenario is you have a plant that is well established, that is a backup to your mother plant. But if your propagation becomes a successful plant on its own, and your mother plant has also started to grow more, so when you combine it together, you just have like a more bigger, more beautiful plant that is bushier and have long trails. And with the method that I'm recommending, you have higher success of achieving that than just sticking cuttings into your mother plant, which I guarantee you half the time wouldn't work, and you're just risking killing your mother plant or wasting your propagations. So that's everything you need to know on how to successfully propagate your pothos from start to finish. And everything that I've discussed here is also written down in my Oasis Life blog. So go check it out. The link is down in the description. And you can also follow me on Instagram at my Oasis Life for more houseplant and sustainable lifestyle content from me. And if you're new to my channel, I hope you subscribe. I come up with videos every week. And if you haven't yet, go check out these videos up here while you wait for my next one. But until then, I see you, I appreciate you, and have a plentiful day. Bye!